there's an element of deterrent in it. I mean, only an element, of course, because this is a barge where you can leave, you can go out into the countryside and so on. So, but probably there's an element of that compared to housing in hotels, which is where 50,000 people claiming asylum are at the moment. But I think it's mainly about that 50,000, that there's more than £5 million a day being spent at the moment keeping people in hotels.
Last night, let's discuss some of this morning's stories with the former leader of the Conservative Party, William Hague. Morning, William.
Good morning.
And the former Scottish Labour leader, Kezia Dugdale. Morning, Kezia.
Good morning.
You can join the conversation by texting 87222, start your message with the word Times, tweet us at Times Radio or email studio@times.radio. Let's start with the Stop the Boats week from the government. There's been many announcements from a crackdown on those lefty lawyers to fines on employers and landlords. Yesterday, 15 migrants got on board the Bibby Stockholm barge, but at least 20 refused. We spoke with Justice Secretary Alex Chalk earlier, and one thing that came up was to what extent the barge is there to put people off. Is the barge a deterrent in your view to say to some people, look where you might end up if you come here?
Well, of course there is an element of that, and I don't think that's something that we should be. You should shrink from being clear about. Of course, we want to be clear about what happens if people come to this country, and so that's why the whole purpose of the Illegal Migration Bill, Illegal Migration Act now, is those that arrive illegally cannot be expected to jump the queue compared to those who have done the right thing, played by the rules, have come here lawfully.
William Hague, there seems to be a bit of confusion on this. This barge is either an appropriate piece of accommodation to handle asylum seekers safely and humanely, or it's a Rwanda-style deterrent to stop people coming in the first place. It can't really be both, can it?
Well, it can be both, of course. I think Alex Chalk put it sort of diplomatically and well in that clip there, saying there's an element of deterrent in it. I mean, only an element, of course, because this is a barge where you can leave, you can go out into the countryside and so on. So, but probably there's an element of that compared to housing in hotels, which is where 50,000 people claiming asylum are at the moment. But I think it's mainly about that 50,000, that there's more than £5 million a day being spent at the moment keeping people in hotels. So the supply of accommodation has to be increased somehow, and you can't just go on indefinitely increasing the use of hotel spaces. So I think it is both, actually. Now, how effective it is as being an element of a deterrent, we will see. That is going to be the question.
Well, answer this question if you can, William, because Asma and I have been wrestling with this, I think, for weeks and weeks and weeks. If we have a problem of the backlog, and it's 50,000 people in hotels, and that's costing $5 million a day, which is a vast amount of money. Why isn't someone in cabinet? Imagine you're in cabinet, William Hague, and someone says, why don't we just spend all the money we're talking about with Rwanda, money we're talking about with doing various stunts in this area, and just employ loads and loads and loads and loads of caseworkers. And if you come in seeking asylum in this country, we'll process you within 20 days. And we're going to spend a fortune on that, because in doing that, we will actually get rid of the backlog, we'll get rid of most of these problems, and we'll have a system by which people come in and come out where necessary.
Well, this is a very good this is the right question to ask, absolutely. And as far as I'm aware, it is the government's policy and hope to get to that point. It is obviously very difficult, though, to get to that when you've got tens of thousands of people. And there are reasons why you can't do it in 20 days, because there are legal appeals and evidence has to be gathered. Every effort has to be made to come to a fair assessment of whether somebody should be given asylum. And you probably need lots of information, lots of discussion, and lots of lawyers talking to each other before you can determine that. So it's not so simple. It's not just like saying, we've got a big backlog of correspondence, so let's just all work on letters and the backlog. Actually, every case can be very difficult. I think that's the answer to your question, unfortunately.
And Kezia, I wonder, we've talked about this before, whether another problem is that ultimately you need to have a thought-through place of where people are going to go if you're saying they're not welcome here, and a willingness to say we're going to have, if we work through a backlog of 50,000 people, 15,000 of them might come into the country and be accepted as asylum seekers, as refugees, and that's quite a high number, and some people might not like that. So those two things might have to be sort of thought through as well.
Well, you're just demonstrating how complex this is an issue in the round. And, to answer your earlier question to William about, can this be both a deterrent and a suitable way of addressing asylum? I think it can. My problem, though, is with the length of time that people might potentially be on this barge. We had a similar example in Scotland with Ukrainians being placed on a ship in leased docks. Now, very small quarters, lots of families on board, an appropriate place to put people for perhaps a week, less than appropriate place to put families for several months. And that, for me, takes you right back to a wider argument, which is about the lack of social housing in this country. The reason we can't put asylum seekers into the existing temporary accommodation stock that we've got is because there's an awful lot of people in temporary accommodation across the United Kingdom who shouldn't be there. They should be in proper social and council housing across the country. And as well as doing what you're suggesting, Stig, and employing lots of people to process these applications, actually, in truth, we need to build an awful lot of social housing as well.
Is almost every problem in this country linked to housing, do you think, Kezia, when it boils right down to it?
Do you know, Stig, I never used to understand the extent to which housing was at the epicentre of inequality in Britain. I didn't really understand it when I was a politician, but by God, I understand it now. So in short, yes, absolutely. You could address so many ills in this country, from people's poor health to inequality to the asylum backlog, by building proper social housing, high quality social housing, and alleviating the pressures across the system. And you get an awful benefit from that as well. You get the economic boom of building and the jobs and the economic growth that stem from that. I cannot understand why the Conservative government, or indeed any government, don't see the value in giving a much greater priority to housing.
William, could you meet Kezia across the aisle and agree on that, do you think?
Yeah, well, there's so many things we couldn't beat across the aisle on, and I think so. But as always, trying to give the stance of the Conservative Party if it's under attack. There will have been 1 million houses built in this Parliament. But the answer, the big problem to what Kezia is describing is, where do you put all the houses? Because we live in a very democratic country where people don't want them near to where they live now. And so we have to find a way of much higher density housing in cities. And but the government went some way towards that in the announcements that Michael Gove made a couple of weeks ago. So I hope they can really now make a success of that and accelerate that house building.
Okay, we're going to move on now and talk about obesity, because researchers have found that obese people's brains are different. They found that the hypothalamus, which regulates the appetite, was larger in people who are overweight. Giles Yeo is Professor of Molecular Endocrinology at the University of Cambridge, and he told us that genetic makeup isn't solely responsible for our weight.
It's not only your ability to exercise willpower, but what excess of food do you actually have? I mean, because look, we're middle-class people, we have carrots and hummus in our fridge. But if you are, say, less likely to say no to food, but you live above a kebab shop, or you live, in a food desert. So the only option you have, if suddenly you're hungry, is to have food that is less healthy for you, well, then that's going to make a difference to what you look like, right? That's going to make a difference to your health. Whereas I may have those same urges of hunger, but if I have access to healthier food, then I'm going to look different. And that is not down to the genes. That is down to the environment that you're actually being exposed to.
So, Kezia, I suppose we've known about the environmental factors that might affect whether you're overweight or obese for a while. We've known about food deserts and about living on top of takeaways and all the rest of it. What perhaps is... Well, I found really quite striking this morning reading this was this idea that the brains of obese people may well be different. That explains to some degree why it'll take them longer to feel full. Kezia, what do you think the value of this is? The value of this discovery?
I can't help but read this story and see myself in it, to be honest, Asma. I mean, I've struggled with my weight the whole of my adult life, and I come from a very middle-class background where there has always been carrots and hummus in the fridge. And I look at my friends, I look at my wife in particular, who's extremely fit and healthy and eats anything under the sun and never seems to put on weight, and think there must be some reason why this is so unfair and so unjust. And the answer is in this article today that there is genetics, that there is a biological process that people's bodies are adapting in response to overeating and self-perpetuating that cycle and promoting it. So it's a tiny bit of an excuse. I know there are wider ways to bypass this. It does involve willpower, it does involve access to good food, but there's no doubt it's a struggle, and some people definitely find it much harder to lose weight than others.
I think it's really interesting because, again, I think there'll be people who listen to this, and I'm not saying that you can always divide people into two camps. There'll be some people who say, well, an excuse now for people who overeat. But I also think it's going to be, I don't know, some comfort to people who have always been larger. I mean, I know someone, I won't say who, I know someone who has always been large. They were a large baby. They were slightly larger as a child, and they've remained that way. And it's been incredibly frustrating. It's affected their entire life. And I think something like this actually won't necessarily make them think, oh, great, that's the reason I'll just keep doing whatever it is I'm doing. It just softens the blow a little bit. I don't know how to explain it, really.
I think that's right. It's absolutely spot on. And again, I see myself in that example you've just shared. It just feels a bit fairer to understand that there might be a scientific rationale for why it's harder for me than it is for other people. And I'm not clinically obese. I am overweight. I've been overweight the whole of my life. Sometimes I've been a lot lighter than I am now, and that's taken an awful lot of effort to get there, but it is a battle, and I think we need to understand there are lots of different reasons for why people are overweight and have lots of different responses as a consequence of that.
Yes. William, what do you take from this research then, that there might actually be something to do with people's brains, or I mean, I still don't quite understand if this is something that people are born with, that they're born with different brains or different shaped brains, that so that there isn't that kind of appetite suppressant. But what do you take from this research?
Well, the research appears to show a correlation, but it doesn't show what's causing what, as I've understood it. So it doesn't actually show necessarily that somebody with a different brain becomes obese. It can be showing that somebody who becomes obese develops a different brain. And so it's not necessarily an excuse for anybody. But of course, they don't need an excuse, because they're not, in most cases, people who become obese are not exercising free will anyway, for the reasons that were mentioned earlier. They're not saying, oh, wouldn't it be great to go out and choose to be obese? They are actually part of that environment, that food desert, where foods heavy in salt and sugar are massively and easily available, and healthy food not so available. So we need I've often written about this, Henry Dimbleby did the whole national food strategy, which would involve taxing those ingredients so things get reformulated, and providing healthier meals in schools and so on. So that's what we need to do quite urgently, I think.
But do you think that's likely? I mean, if we have a change in government, things may change. But the current, I mean, and we've gone back and forward on this a bit over the last couple of years. But the current thinking seems to be to not intervene, to not be at the mercy of the so-called nanny state.
Yeah, it's not clear, actually. I think that either main political party is really going to grip this. But some steps have been taken. Of course, there have been recent changes in how counters can be laid out in shops.
Yeah.
Soft drinks industry levy has been a big success that was imposed in 2016. That really has reduced the amount of sugar in many soft drinks without driving up the price. So that's exactly what, a can of Coke in Britain now contains a lot less sugar than a can of Coke in America, for instance. People may not notice that, but it does. So, that some steps have been taken, but we do need a lot more from either party on this. They're all a bit too scared of the nanny state criticism.
I want to join together two stories we've talked about today. One is this restaurant in Kensington that's been receiving 1-star reviews, and its owner, James Chiavarini, has even been told to kill himself because he hosted a dinner for former Olympians Sharon Davis and Daley Thompson to celebrate the campaign group Fair Play for Women, who focus on women's position in sport. That's one story. The other story that you may have seen is this actor Amanda Abington, who will take part on Strictly Come Dancing this year. She has gone on Instagram to say she's not transphobic because people are threatening to boycott her show because she once did a tweet which was critical of a drag show. and she says, I didn't really mean anything. There was a 12-year-old talking to 2-year-olds, and I thought it was inappropriate. And please don't boycott Strictly because of this. Kezia, the banal and naive point, but maybe the true one here, is that wouldn't it just be nicer if people could have disagreements on areas that are broadly contentious without resorting to abuse on either side?
Oh, 100%. How do we make that so, Stig, though? That's the question for me. I wish it were so easy. And these are both terrible stories. I don't want to see anybody being penalised for who they have in their restaurants, or anybody being cancelled for a tweet that they've done that stops millions of people watching a particular TV show. I mean, is nothing sacred that even Strictly Come Dancing's now under threat from some sort of boycott? And I say that as a trans ally, somebody who feels very strongly about this issue, because I will, to my dying day, picture constituents I had in my surgery as a politician desperately in need of access to services to support their transition, who were suicidal because of their inability to live their life as who they are. So I've got a great deal of sympathy, and my heart is full for people campaigning for trans rights, but this doesn't help their cause.
No.
Very far from it.
That's the point, isn't it, that I always keep writing. I've met lots of trans people in my career, and when you meet them, you cannot not but feel that you want to just extend them love and hope that they get through it and hope that they achieve happiness. But there's that very small group of people, and then there's the culture war that surrounds it, Kezia, which has got nothing to do with it. And I do come back to this question of, the women's sport thing seems to be an area where people who campaign to have a person born a man competing in women's sport do people who are trans no service whatsoever, because they make the argument about something very specific, which has got nothing to do with the lives of most people.
Yes, and that's why nuance is so important, right, Stig? And that's what we've lost all sight of. It's completely and utterly abandoned. And I'm much more interested in how can we kind of rebuild some bridges, for want of a better cliche, at least to make some progress on this front, because we've got the one bill in Scotland designed to improve trans rights held up in the courts, and we've got the UK government currently stepping back from any plans it had to reform the law, and it looks increasingly like the UK Labour Party are running a mile from it as well. The focus here should be on finding that balance between improving and enhancing the rights of trans people and addressing the concerns that some women have about same-sex spaces. I do think it's possible to do both, but it will require nuance, sensitivity, conversation and listening. And let me just finally say, Stig, I'm very aware that I haven't always done that, so I don't want to sound like I'm preaching. I've made mistakes around this before. I'm trying really hard to focus on what the priority should be, which is finding that middle ground.
Yeah, and William, how we find a middle ground on a social media platforms that are specifically designed to find the things that divide rather than things that unite, really. That's what the algorithm often does. And maybe it's institutions have to say, we're not going to cancel people. If this woman, Amanda Abington, said a tweet a while ago, maybe it just takes for the BBC to say, well, sod you all. We picked her. It's fine. She's not going to be cancelled, and we're just not going to respond to this type of nastiness, because it's so unhealthy for the common weal, really.
Yeah, the BBC should say that, absolutely. And you're right about social media, which doesn't lend itself to putting things in context. She's being criticised, Amanda Abington, for a tweet. You don't explain a lot in a tweet. She's made what seems to me to be a very reasonable defense of what she said, that what she was criticising was not having a drag show. It was the a 12-year-old appearing in it in a very sexualized context. She's explained that. But in a tweet itself, of course, you don't explain all of that, because it's just that 280 characters or whatever it is now. And then that and the algorithms do contribute to it. But yes, institutions have to be strong in the face of unacceptable behavior. I'm totally with what Kezia has just said. And we should all be sticking up for this restaurant where Sharon Davies and Daley Thompson were just exercising perfectly reasonable free speech from what one can see.
Finally, in today's Times, Susie Goldsborough has pondered the question, who are the cultural veterans of tomorrow? Now, there are many stars today who've been around for a very long time, as we were commenting on earlier. Elton John, Ridley Scott, Diana Ross, they've all mastered their crafts and seem to timelessly define culture. But who are the Elton Johns and Diana Rosses of the future? Who are your kind of, I don't know, maybe midlife icons who are going to be the cultural veterans of tomorrow? Kezia, do you have any nominations?
I don't have any nominations, but I have been thinking hard about this. What made those people successful? Were they just of the moment, or was it the fact that they always adapted to the moment? And it makes me wonder, are Harry Styles and Taylor Swift really going to be with us, in 40, 50 years' time in a new fangled form? I'm not sure about that. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just not sure the answer.
Oh God.
I'm a Swiftie now, you see. The problem
He's a Swiftie.
She's better than Elton John, Taylor Swift. Why shouldn't she last?
What? Utter nonsense.
Taylor Swift is measurably better than Elton John.
Okay,
Kezia
calm
Dugdale.
down.
We need a whole other half an hour to discuss that. That needs taken apart and rebuilt.
It's going to be a spin-off podcast.
Yeah.
William Hague, do you have similar strong feelings about Elton John versus Taylor Swift?
I think I'm on Stig's side on this.
Oh, no.
No, I think Taylor Swift will prove to be culturally significant, and she's done important things like take on Spotify, although not necessarily won against Spotify, and that 3-year period where she wouldn't allow her albums to be played on it. So no, I'm on that side of it, but it is difficult in an age where people live so long. It's great that they live so long. But in my favorite period, the 18th century, you have people like Mozart, absolute stars at 8 years old, because most of the other composers had died. I mean, apart from him just being brilliant anyway. And a lot of them died in their 30s and 40s. It was easier for the young stars to emerge. So all these old stars are sort of standing in the way of that, aren't they?
Well, it's interesting. Kezia, I suppose... I mean, so many things have changed, obviously. We were talking earlier about working patterns and how the 9 to 5 in an office has kind of, died a death slightly. And we're talking about that because Zoom say they want more people, more of their staff to actually get off Zoom and get back into work. So many things have changed and been reinvented. And I wonder whether the template that benefited and caused people like Elton John or whatever to have this longevity of of decades and decades. Cliff Richard, even people like that. I'm not saying he's a cultural icon, but he's somebody who's been going a long time. Whether that just won't actually exist anyway in 10 or 20 or 30 years.
It's so interesting, isn't it? But I think the best chance of surviving and evolving with the times would be to adapt with it. And nobody can question Elton John's ability to do that. I'm going to go back and defend Elton John again.
Goodness.
I'm utterly incredulous at the idea that MD can argue Taylor Swift is more culturally important than Elton John. I'm really not going to get over that today. It's going to be in my mind all day.
There's absolutely no doubt that to an entire generation of young women, Taylor Swift is a lodestar and beacon. I have a lot of them in my family, as it happens. That's why I feel this.
But it may not last that long.
No, and maybe
that's the point.
And your point, as well, I think is really interesting. That maybe Elton John, because he produced albums and records and things that people touched, and maybe that is a difference that all these people in the past had. We went to the cinema to see Ridley Scott films, and maybe that's the difference.
Possibly.
But he also reinvented whole ways of presenting himself when he felt like he was becoming less cool. Like that when he came back in the 2000s, the video with Robert Downey Jr. Like he found new ways to promote his art.
Cool. What is nonsense this is?
Okay, you two are just going to have to argue this out another time. Kezia, thank you very much. That's Kezia Dugdale.
I quit.
No, don't do that. We need you back here next Tuesday with William Hague. Thank you to both of you.